I have a Minolta MC W Rokkor-NL 21mm f2.8 lens here that I'm going to be fully disassembling. Before starting on the disassembly, let me just say that this is probably my favorite Minolta Rokkor lens. And if you look at some of the photos on my website, I'd say that 80 or 90% of the photos I've taken over the past 2 or 3 years have been shot with a 21mm Rokkor-NL on a NEX7 camera. And there's no real quantitative reason I can point to and say that's why I like this lens. Because if you look at the images it produces closely, this lens is not terribly sharp. It has some distortion. It has some chromatic abrasion. So it's a hard lens to actually get good results out of. And it's kind of bulky as well. But when you do use this lens properly, I just really like the types of images that it produces. And I like the way it controls as well. I'm going to be fully disassembling this lens today, getting access to the optics, all the body sections and mechanical sections of the lens, and then also disassembling the diaphragm. Optically, this lens is kind of interesting because it's optically one of the most complicated lenses that Minolta produced, with the exception of perhaps the Shift CA 35mm Rokkor. It has the most elements and groups of any of those lenses, but one nice feature of this lens is that you can actually disassemble all those optics and clean almost every element individually really easily. More easily than on some of the more common 50mm Rokkor lenses even. If you look at the copy I have here, there are two little problems you may notice with it. If on one of the inner surfaces here, if I can get the right angle of light, there's a bit of coating wear where some fungus or haze is built up. It's more noticeable on the back optic as well. It looks bad, but really unless you're shooting into the sun, which this lens is never good at, then you never notice this in normal use. The other problem is the diaphragm is a slight bit sluggish, which is why I'm going to be taking it apart and cleaning it off fully. So to start off the disassembly, I'll actually flip the lens over here and get access to the back of the diaphragm. Notice the back optic is much smaller than the entire front optics, and it is just held in place, just screws in place here, and there are two little divots for a spanning wrench on the outermost black ring. So go in and remove this back optic to expose the back of the diaphragm. Okay, and as I was mentioning, all the optics in this lens can be further disassembled. So if you look more closely at this, see if I can focus here, you'll notice that there are other little rings in here with divots for a spanning wrench on both sides here. So all the optics can be further taken apart to actually get access to the individual elements and clean inside of there if you need to. So now we have access to the back of the diaphragm here. And I'll just flip over the lens again. And to actually get access to the next layer of the diaphragm here, we're going to continue on in the back section. And what we want to do now is separate the two sections here. So there's the top section, which has the focusing ring and all the front optics, from the back section, which has the mounting plate. So looking at the back of the lens here, on the mounting plate, first off there's this silver ring going around the back here. And that's actually part of the mounting plate, and it has 3 little screws going around it. So I'll just loosen up these little screws. You don't need to actually remove them fully. And then slide off this silver ring. Okay, and that exposes the aperture control ring. You can't actually remove the aperture control ring in its current state. And the things that are holding it in place, it just slides on here, but there are 2 pieces that are actually holding it in place. There's this little lever over here, which sits on top of it, and then the actual aperture control curve, which also sits on top of it. So later we'll actually remove those 2 and remove the aperture control ring. But for now, I'm going to spin the aperture control ring around until in these little half circle shaped sections I can see the 4 screws down below. And I'm going to remove those 4 to actually separate the 2 sections of the lens. So now I've separated out the mounting plate and the entire front assembly of the lens. And you'll see the diaphragm is still in the front section for now. So now I'm just going to flip over the lens, and the rest we have to actually go in through the front of the lens to continue on with the disassembly and remove the diaphragm. So there are actually quite a few steps that you have to go through to remove the diaphragm fully. So looking here at the front of the lens, if I focus out, you notice on the front we have the front optic and then the name ring, but actually what I want to do at this stage is remove the entire front optical, or the entire front black housing here that's going around from the focusing ring up. And that's held in place if you focus all the way to the minimum focusing distance. There are 3 little black screws on this top section that are holding this in place. So I'll just undo these 3. And set that aside. And now looking at, I've exposed the focusing mechanism top and the front optic as well. So to actually get access to the diaphragm, we actually have to remove all the optical pieces independently. So the first one I'll remove is just this first large optical group going around here. Just screws into place, so I'll grab it. Remove that. Again, it has lots of little divots and things, so you can actually disassemble this piece further. Next up, we have this next optical piece, and it has 2 little pockets here. You can use a pointed tip spanning wrench on to actually unscrew it. Okay, so lift off that kind of saucer-shaped piece. And then finally, there's this one last optical piece. And when I originally took apart this lens, there was some black foam going around in this section in here. But after 50 years or so, that was pretty much crumbling to pieces, so I just cleared that off because it was getting little black specks of foam in all the optics and things. So on this optical piece, there are actually 2 sets of divots. There's the inner ones right here and here, and then the outer ones here and here. And you actually want to, if you're getting access to the diaphragm, you want to use a flat tip spanning wrench and remove just the outermost divots. And that will undo the entire optic and expose the front of the diaphragm. Okay, so there's that piece as well. Last optical piece. Now we have access to both sides of the diaphragm here. But actually removing the diaphragm at this stage is really easy. It, on the back section here, is just held in place by 4 screws. So I'll undo these 4 and it will just fall out of position. Each of these screws has a little washer as well. So if you look at the diaphragm, it's nice and it's a separate component. It doesn't have any springs or anything on it. And I'll take this apart in a moment. Looking at this last component here, this is the entire focusing mechanism. And there's one kind of interesting thing that you can take apart here. Ideally, I would have taken this entire thing apart as well and actually separated this all out. And I tried to do that by going in through the back section here. The way that the focusing mechanism works is that on the back section, there are these 2 metal plates that have, they're going into these grooves on the intersection of the focusing mechanism. And these bars are actually what are holding the inner part of the focusing mechanism in place so that as you focus, it moves forwards and backwards instead of just rotating around. So you can remove these 2 plates and then actually start removing some of the intersections here. But ideally what you'd like to do is remove the focusing ring on the outside here so that it can be cleaned. And I'll just remove 1 or 2 more components to show why I had trouble doing that. So on this copper colored section going around here, there's this bar, and this bar is actually what is coupling, or it's holding the optics, the front optics in place, or spacing the front optics out. It's kind of a different setup than on the 50mm Minolta lenses, but I'll remove these 2 screws right here and here, and then just remove that entire bar. And you might also want to mark where this was lining up so that you can reattach it correctly. Bar will just slide out of place now. Set that aside, and then I'll spin this thing out. Remove that piece. Also set it aside. And you can see that that piece was coupling into this black lever, right, or this black fork right down there. The little bar section was coupling into that. And if you look down, there's a cutout on the top of this silver section in here. So the cutout is over here. And there's 2 screws that you can see if you rotate this all about. There's one over here, and then there's one here and one here. And using, or by rotating this about, I was able to get access to 2 of those screws, but I wasn't able to get access to the 3rd one. It was just off the edge there, and I wasn't sure how to undo it. So I believe that if you were able to undo the 2 or the 3 screws in this section in here, and then also undo the 3 little black screws going around here, you would be able to actually separate the focusing ring on the outside so that it can be cleaned on its own. But because I wasn't able to do that, there's not a whole lot of point to actually taking apart the rest of the lens here. You can clean the focusing mechanism and add oil as needed in its current state pretty easily. Now let's just look back at the back of the lens section here, the mounting plate, and actually remove the aperture control ring. So the aperture control ring, as I pointed out before, had the two sections that were holding it in place. The lever here on the outside, and then it's going through on the inside right here. And the aperture control curve, so here on the outside, and then on the inside right here. So we'll just remove both of these. So for the lever, let me put on a lens cap so it's a little flatter. The lever it just has this slotted screw right here that is holding it in place. And it has a little wire that's providing the actual spring mechanism and a whole bunch of little pieces. But I'll just set that aside as one component for now. And then, before I remove this other piece, I'm just going to remove the little ball bearing that provides the clicking sound as this turns back and forth. So the ball bearing is behind this slotted screw on the exterior right here. So I'll just undo this. This just helps because when you're disassembling, you don't have to worry about losing the ball bearing. So there's the ball bearing. Set those aside. And now I'll just remove the aperture control curve. It has these two little screws right there and there. Okay, now I've undone those. And I can just, on the inside of the lens, kind of mess around with the aperture control curve until it falls out of position like that. Now I can just take off the entire aperture control ring and it can be cleaned on its own. And we also have the mounting plate piece here. Now finally, I'll start disassembling the diaphragm. So the diaphragm itself is a very simple component. It doesn't have, as I mentioned, no springs or anything on it. It just has this lever that moves things back and forth. And what this lever actually does is it controls the back plate of the diaphragm. We can see the front plate of the diaphragm, and then the blades themselves are sandwiched in between. The front plate is fixed, the back plate is what moves back and forth. So we actually want to remove the front plate here, and that is held in place by 3 little set screws going around on the exterior of the diaphragm. Now I should be able to just slide both plates out like that. And I've kind of messed up the blades a little bit, but that's okay because we're disassembling it. And now I can separate the 2 plates and also separate out the blades here. Okay, so you can see the 6 blades there. The diaphragm is small, but it's a reasonable size. You can actually work with it, unlike on some of like the 28mm Rokkor lenses where the diaphragm really is just too small to work with. So now we have all the individual blades. Now I actually want to clean off the individual blades. So I've grabbed a flat bottom dish here, and I'm just going to move each of the blades into there, handling them with a tweezer so not to get more oil on them. And now I'll just use a slight amount of isopropyl alcohol in the dish and clean off each blade individually. And I'll also clean off the housing as well. When cleaning off the blades, you want to be careful not to press on the sides too hard, especially over by the little post right here that's over by the slot, just because you don't want to warp the blades. And also you want to be sure that you're using a flat bottom dish so that when you press up against them, you're not distorting them. So here I'll just go in, and for each blade in here, I'll very gently run a Q-tip over it just to remove some of the surface oil. Flip it over, do the same thing on the other side. And just repeat that with the other blades. Again, being careful not to actually handle the blades with your fingers after you've cleaned them off, because then you'll have to clean them off again. So I'll just repeat that. Alright, so that has all the blades cleaned off, and then I also just want to clean off the different plates in here as well. Make sure that there's no oil on them. And the housing itself as well. With that, we have the lens pretty much all disassembled here. And you can see that there are quite a few components and a lot of little components as well you have to be careful not to lose. And especially if you start then disassembling the optics further, then it really, there's a lot of components to this lens. So we have all the optics here, most of which can be further disassembled, all the front optics, and then the smaller back optic, separate from the body sections like the main front housing here, and some of the focusing or the aperture control ring, and some of the mounting plate rings, separate from the mechanical sections like the mounting plate itself and the focusing mechanism, and then the diaphragm itself over here, so the diaphragm all disassembled. So now we'll start on the reassembly of this lens, and we'll start by reassembling the diaphragm first. So looking here at the diaphragm, if you actually look at each blade here, let me grab one of them and see if I can kind of get a better view of that. Each blade has two components on this larger section over here that we kind of have to pay attention to. One is this little slot that's running along there, a little pill-shaped slot. The other one is this post on this side. And this post only sticks up on one side of the blade. If you look at the other side of the blade, it's flat over there. So what actually happens here, on the back of the diaphragm, this is the back mounting plate of the diaphragm, you'll notice that there are a bunch of little posts, 6 little posts going around on the back section here, kind of jutting out. So each of the slots on the blade will go on one of those posts. And then on the front plate here, there are 6 little holes going around here. So each of the posts on the diaphragm blade will go into one of those holes. The front plate is actually what's locked in place, whereas the back plate moves and rotates around to actually control the diaphragm. So the easiest way I found to do this is to actually start with the front plate and get things in place on the front plate, then lower the back plate into place. So I'll just grab a blade here, make sure the post is facing downwards, and just get it aligned and set it into one of the little holes on the front plate here. And I want to make sure that the blade is going inwards so that the other hole is also visible right there, the one that the blade is kind of sticking towards. And then I'll just keep going around for the next 4 blades or so, setting them in place so that they overlap and go on top of the blade that I previously set. So next up I'll set this one. Do the same thing, kind of nudge it over. And just continue with the next 2. And this final blade is the only really complicated one because it has to go under the first blade and on top of the last one that we just put in. So I'll kick out the first blade here so that it's kind of going into the center. That. Now I'll take this blade and just kind of slide it underneath that first one. Now lift the first blade back on top of the other one, on top of the one I just put down. And there we go. So now they're all correctly overlapping going around. And I'll take this, just set it down like that. Now I have to get this back plate back into position and get each of the little pegs on the back here into one of the slots on the front section here. So to help with that, I'm just going to line up all the blades so that they're going around the diameter here, or the circumference, I mean, of this intersection right here. So just line up all those blades nicely. Okay, and now I'll just take this back plate and lower it into position. You can see that it has little indicators of where the posts actually are that might help with lining this whole thing up. And then just kind of move it back and forth until it falls down like that. And now if I actually move the post or the back plate back and forth here, notice that the diaphragm is now operating correctly. So I'll leave it open for now. And the final step is to get it back into the housing here. So I'll grab this, and we have to get this metal post on the back section here through the little pill-shaped opening right here. So the easiest way to do this, I found, is to do it kind of upside down. So you hold the housing like this, and then grab the front of the front plate here with 2 or 3 fingers, and just push it up into the housing, being careful to make sure that all the different sides are aligned properly. Okay, now it should be flat against the back section there. I don't want to set this down quite yet because the back post will kind of push up the front plate there. So now I'll get the 3 little slotted screws back in place and just lock this down in any position to start with. And we'll adjust it in a moment or two to actually get it to open and close correctly. Okay, and what you may notice now is on your copy that the diaphragm actually doesn't open and close properly, and that's just because the front plate is out of alignment, so that when I move this back and forth, it's not fully opening, or it's actually not fully closing as it should. So what we have to do is just spin the front plate around a little bit to get this thing back in alignment. So I'll just slightly loosen up the 3 screws here. Now I'll spin around this top plate a little bit until I can get the minimum aperture looking correct. What we want to have is a reasonable looking minimum aperture, and have the maximum aperture be so that none of the blades are visible. So that's a little bit small on the minimum aperture there. Let me retry that. Okay, so that's looking better. Now I'll just tighten down the other 2 screws here. You can see that the blades move a little bit better, but there's not a huge difference because there wasn't too much oil on them in this case, but they are moving much more smoothly like you would expect. So I'll just set that piece aside. Now we'll start on the rest of the reassembly here. So first off, getting the aperture control ring back in place. The aperture control ring here just slides in place, but it has this little silver screw right over near the 21mm indicator, which is actually limiting how far you can turn the aperture control ring in either direction. So looking here at the ring itself, there's this kind of cutout right here, which has to go on top of the screw, and then you want the numbers facing upwards when you actually slide this in place as well. So I'll just get those in place, and then it should actually move back and forth between the minimum and maximum aperture here properly and click at either end. Now we have to actually get the 2 components here back in place, which were actually sitting on top of the aperture control ring. So one was the aperture control curve, which was going in over here. The other was that little lever. So we'll start with the aperture control curve. So I'll grab this piece right here, and then flip over the aperture control ring. And you'll notice that over by where the 2 little screws are right in here, on the intersection, there's a little cutout as well. So I want to slide the aperture control curve with the larger section, the little notch over here, going that way. And I just want to slide it behind this little post in here. And then when you actually look at it from the back side over here, you should see it sticking out on this side so that we can reattach it now. So I'll just use the 2 little screws there to reattach this. And it doesn't have to be, this is actually one of the components that you can adjust how the aperture is controlled with, just by reattaching it in slightly different positions. So I'll just reattach it in my best guess for the position right now. But you can actually move around how the screws are going and locking this down in this component to adjust that slightly. And if things went correctly here, you should notice that when it's at the minimum aperture, so 16 right now, it's over on this part of the curve, the flatter section of the curve. And when it's at the maximum aperture, it gets kicked up onto the knob over here. And that's actually what's providing, as this moves back and forth, as this post here moves back and forth, it controls this whole crescent-shaped piece, which is then coupled into the actual aperture. So that's what's controlling the size of the aperture, this curve, when you actually adjust the aperture control ring. This post in here, or this metal piece in here, is also controlled directly by the stop-down lever on the back, which also adjusts the aperture. The other component we have to get back in place is this little lever here. So there were actually 2 components to this little lever. There's the lever itself, and then all the spring mechanism and couplings that sit on top of the lever. So if you look at this piece here, you'll notice that it has the external side and then this plate that's sitting on the top here. So this is actually the orientation it's going to go in, with the larger side going down and then the little plate that's actually going into the inside of the lens sitting on top. And it's just going to slide in place right over into this slot here on the inside of the lens, like this. And there's a screw hole that it has to line up with in the center here. For this next piece, which is what's actually providing the spring mechanism to keep this open, it has a little washer and then also a little wire that goes with it. So the washer needs to go onto the screw, and I'll just start by, first off, here, let me get the wire off there. First off, screwing this down to actually lock the little lever in place. The lever should move freely back and forth here. Now I have this little wire. It might be easier if on your copy to actually keep the little wire in place during the reassembly, but it tends to fall out of position. This little wire has two pieces. So there's a longer side over here and a shorter side right here that I'm holding on to. And the shorter side and the longer side both have hooks that kind of go down, if you're looking at it from on the top right there. And then the middle section. So the middle section is going to go over the screw right here. The longer side is then going to loop over to this little bar right there. And the shorter side is going to bend around and go on the back side of the lever to actually keep it sprung open. So I'll just position this like this, and first off get the longer side in position. I'm sorry, the longer side actually does not go against anything. It's just going up against the side here. It does not actually go on this bar when you're doing the reassembly. And now I just want to make sure that this is fully onto the screw there. Now I'll take the shorter side and just bend it so that it goes on this side of the lever and actually keeps things sprung open. So I have the longer side just anchored up against the side of the housing, shorter side on this side of the little metal piece, and the whole thing wrapped around the screw right there. And if you did that correctly, then the little lever here should spring back open automatically when you hit it. Then finally, just to complete the reassembly of the diaphragm piece right there, or of the aperture control ring right there, we'll reinstall the little ball bearing. So the little ball bearing is right on the end of the screw here. And I'll just put both of these components back in, so that now when I turn the aperture control ring, it makes that clicking sound. Now I actually have to reattach the focusing mechanism here with the back mechanical section and mounting plates. So these two are just going to screw together, but the proper orientation for these, you want to have the focusing indicator actually going over by the numbers here. And if you look at this back section, there's actually a little thing that sticks up here, a little notch that sticks up. That's going to go into a slot on the focusing mechanism in here that limits how far you can focus in either direction. So to line these up, once you get these lined up, it should stop at the two extremes of the focusing automatically. And then you can find out, let me spin around the aperture control ring to expose the 4 little screw holes there. You can find where the actual, when the screws are actually visible here, so like that, and reconnect these two pieces. Okay, you can make sure that it's still focusing properly between the two extremes now. This is also a good point to reinstall the diaphragm itself. So we have the diaphragm here, and the actual mechanical setup on this lens is very simple. So the diaphragm doesn't have any components on it or mechanical components on it, and it just needs to have this silver section on the back, the silver post, go into this little pocket right here, which is controlled by that black crescent-shaped piece, both with the aperture control ring and with the stop-down lever. So I'll just slide this in place. Get that going into the post there as well. And you'll notice that when you reattach these, with the 4 screws in here, they don't have a set position that they have to be locked down into. So this is another area where you can readjust how the aperture is opened and closed by actually spinning this around internally and adjusting where you lock down the 4 screws in here. So I'll just set this over to be at the minimum aperture, and I want to make sure that none of the blades are visible at the minimum aperture. That's usually a pretty good guide, and I'll lock it down with the 4 screws in here. Each of these screws does have a little washer on it as well. So what you should see when you're actually adjusting the aperture here is that it clicks or actually moves a little bit at each stop, and that when it's fully open, so at 2.8, none of the blades are visible, and then it's not obviously fully closed when it's actually at the minimum aperture. So this looks pretty good, and you also notice that now that after cleaning off the blades here, it's much more snappy than it was before. There was nothing really wrong with it before. It was still perfectly usable for shooting film, but now it's a lot better moving. We don't have to worry about the blades potentially becoming more stuck in the future. And just put on a few more back components here. So we have the silver mounting plate ring. This is just going to slide into place on top of here, but it has a cutout over in this section that needs to go on top of the little lever right there. And then the 3 screw holes lining up, they also need to line up with the little indentations that go around there. So I'll just get this lined up kind of visually, lower it in place, and then tighten down the 3 little slotted screws going around there. You want to check that after you do this, that the aperture control ring still moves fine. So this looks good, but if it's stuck, you can just lift up this little ring a little bit to readjust things. And we may as well just finish up the back reassembly at this stage. So we have the back optic that just is going to screw in place. And I'll use a spanning wrench to actually lock it down fully. And finally, on the back section here, we have this plate that just goes over and prevents debris from entering the lens. So this plate is just going to sit so that the lever over here goes up to the gap in it there, and it just has the 3 little black screws to reattach it. Okay, so that has the entire back of the lens reassembled. So let me get a lens cap here. Now we'll actually start putting together the front of the lens and getting it optically reassembled as well. We'll start off with this thicker piece here that has the smallest diameter. And this is just going to screw down on top of the diaphragm as the first component. So I'll just get it in place first. And this was the piece that did have the foam going around on the outside. Like I said, I don't really know exactly what purpose the foam had. So I just removed it because it was falling apart and the little foam specks were getting everywhere. And I'll use a spanning wrench now in the 2 outermost divots, so here, in those 2 slots, to actually screw this down fully. So now we actually have to reinstall the last component of the focusing mechanism that actually moves things back and forward and houses the frontmost optics. So this kind of brass colored ring just is going to screw in place onto the focusing mechanism here. Okay, and now we actually, on this piece, we want to find out, so looking down, there's the black, it's a little hard to see here, there's the black section down inside the focusing ring, the black fork-shaped piece. That is going to have this piece right here, the center section of this piece is going to go down inside the black fork and actually lock this top section down in place. So if you actually marked where things were lining up originally on the focusing mechanism, you want to find the same alignment and actually line these things back up. So instead of, and this is also how you would adjust the focusing, with the long slots in here, you can actually spin around the inner part of the focusing mechanism to adjust how things focus, unlike other lenses where you actually, because I wasn't able to remove this focusing ring here, that's how I found you could adjust the focusing. So I'll just first off slide this in place. And now I'll line it up with the marks I made originally. Now it's all lined up with the original marks I made, and I'll just use these two Phillips head screws to lock it back in place. Now I've just kind of reattached it in an arbitrary position, and it may not actually be optically zeroed. I guessed, and I made marks initially, but it would be best to actually optically zero it. So to optically zero it, we actually need to get it optically completely reassembled here. So I'll reinstall the next optical piece, which is this saucer-shaped one. It just screws in place on the top section here. Okay, and I'll use a pointed tip spanning wrench now, and the two little indentations on either side here to lock this piece down the rest of the way. And then finally, the front optic itself, the large front optic. Also, it just screws in place. Okay, so now I have the lens all optically reassembled. But regarding the zeroing, what you want to do is mount the lens in its current state on your camera and find where it's optically focused to infinity. You may have to actually remove the two connectors here and spin around the optics independently to move them up and down to get it optically focused at infinity. But once you find where it's optically focused at infinity, you want to move the indicator here so that it's indicating infinity, and then reattach this bar so that the indicator is indicating infinity and it's optically at infinity as well, and that will re-zero the lens. But for this video, I'll just assume that it's now properly optically focused at infinity, and just continue on with the reassembly. There aren't too many more components now. We have the housing piece right here that goes over the entire front section, and the only thing that has to get lined up properly for this is there's a blue dot on the top section right there. That dot should get lined up with the indicator right here as well, and then there are the three screw holes going around. But it's easier to just start by lining up the dot, focusing all the way to the minimum focusing distance, and then spinning this around so that the three screw holes are lined up and that dot is also lined up. And then I'll use the three black screws to reattach this piece. Okay, and just the last piece now, name ring, has to get screwed back in place. So it just threads back in here on the top. And I'll use the spanning wrench and the two divots on the exterior here to fully tighten this down as well. Alright, so that has the reassembly of this lens complete now. You can check and make sure that things are operating as expected. So the aperture control ring here, correctly controlling the aperture, stop down lever, doing its thing, and that for focusing, you can focus between the two extremes, so 0.25 meters on one end and infinity on the other here. And that when you're set to infinity over here, the lens is optically focused to infinity as well. Overall, this is a very repairable lens, but it's one that's not too easy to actually take apart and repair, especially if you're not used to disassembling Minolta lenses. What makes this lens very repairable is that it uses all high-quality metal components internally for the most part, and all those components can be disassembled very easily, with the exception I found of the actual focusing mechanism here. That's especially important for things like the optics. This lens has probably one of the most complicated optical setups of any of the Minolta lenses with all these different groups and things, but you can actually disassemble those and clean inside of the optics and get access to the individual elements really easily, even more easily than you can on some of the 50mm Minolta lenses. Some things that make this lens not too easy to actually take apart and repair on your own, though, it has a very different setup than the more common 50mm Minolta lenses, so that if you've taken one of those apart before, these lenses don't really have anything in common, so it's very different. And then also it has a lot of components, and to get access to some of the simple components like the diaphragm, you have to do quite a few steps. So to actually remove the diaphragm, you have to go in and remove all the different optical pieces in the front of the lens. But overall, more subjectively, I just think this is an awesome lens. It's great for a certain type of photography. It's the lens that like I said, it's the lens that I've probably shot 90% of the photos I've taken over the past couple of years in, and it's the lens that I pretty much always keep mounted on my camera. So if you do have a copy that can be repaired, I highly, highly recommend it.